So Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Mr. Chairman, it's a privilege to speak in this debate under your chairmanship. And I start by congratulating my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, for securing this important debate to mark the 75th anniversary of the Korean War, and for, frankly, a really excellent opening speech and remarks. So it's a great privilege to represent my constituency of the North Cotswold, a constituency I've had the honour to represent in some guises since 1992, and it includes the largest geographical chunk of Gloucestershire where undoubtedly members of the Gloucester Regiment's families still live. As we commemorate this important anniversary, let me start, as others have done, by paying tribute to the courage and sacrifice of the Gloucestershire Regiment during the Battle of the Imogen River in April 1951. And I acknowledge, as my right honourable friend did, it is, of course, not only the Gloucester Regiment, but it is, of course, all our airmen, navalmen and other soldiers who were part of this operation. But it was the Gloucesters, in the face of a powerful 42,000 Chinese soldiers, that the 1st Battalion, the Glorious Gloucesters, held their position alone for 3 days. And in the end, there were 662 casualties, 56 were killed, 522 were taken prisoners, many of whom had already endured German and Japanese prisoner of war camps in World War II, as others have said. And it was because of this connection with the Gloucesters that I chaired the APG for North Korea for many years, and I was very pleased that my right honourable friend took it over from me. As I say, it's on behalf of all those families and the relatives who live elsewhere that I'd like to pay tribute to the Gloucesters. According to General James Van Fleet, commander of the United Nations forces in Korea, the Gloucesters' stand at Imogen, and I quote, was the most outstanding example of unit bravery in modern warfare. Their heroic defence plugged a large gap in the Allied line, and ultimately, as my right honourable friends have said, it prevented the North Korean forces from capturing Seoul, where I have visited on several occasions, and helped pave the way for the establishment of a free, prosperous South Korea. The courage and sacrifice of the Gloucesters secured freedom, as my right honourable friend has said, for one half of the Korean peninsula. And even as the other half continues to suffer badly today, under the repressive yoke of one of the most repressive and brutal regimes, with the worst human rights records in the world. For their actions during the battle, the Gloucesters were awarded the US Presidential Unit Citation, a rare honour for non-American armed forces. 2 of the men from the regiment were also posthumously rewarded the Victoria Cross, the British Empire's highest military decoration for valour. They included, as my honourable friend has already alluded to, Lieutenant Philip Curtis, for leading a counter-attack on Chinese position at Castle Hill, buying time for his comrades. There were also 2 awards of Distinguished Service Order, 6 military crosses, 2 Distinguished Contract Medals, and 10 military medals. The actions of the Gloucesters at Imogen remains one of the British Army's finest hours.
Well, my right honourable friend.
Of course.
Just briefly, he highlights that the Gloucesters, the glorious Gloucesters, were awarded a US Presidential Unit Citation, which is extremely rare for a non-American unit. And there's another link, that at the Korean War Memorial in Washington, it has a very brief inscription which reads simply, "Freedom is not free." Would he agree with me that the defence of Gloucester Hill by the glorious Gloucesters and the casualties they suffered was a living embodiment of that great motto?
My right honourable friend is entirely right. Freedom is not free, and nor is it enduring. We cannot assume that we will always be free. We have to continuously fight and believe in it. And that is why we want to support Ukraine and other countries that are being unjustly penalised in an illegal war to make sure that they can remain free, just as we have those freedoms that we often take for granted in this country. We must never take those freedoms for granted. I come to a slightly sad bit in my speech today. Many of these who were killed, the glorious Gloucesters who were killed in North Korea, their bodies still remain there. As many of my colleagues will be aware, I have previously been involved in efforts to try and return their remains to Britain. Whilst making a note of the current geographical climate, I would like to ask the Minister if he would work with me to ensure that the remaining Gloucesters are brought home so that their families can finally give them a dignified burial. And there is precedent for this. When there was a little bit of rapprochement by President Trump in his last meetings with the President of North Korea, some of the American bodies were brought home. And I would say to the Minister, if there becomes an opportunity in the future in a next rapprochement, if he could support me in pushing for that, I could then arrange for the bodies to be categorised and returned in a dignified way to those families, and they would be able to lay those bodies at rest. As we now mark the 75th anniversary of the Korean War, let us turn our attention to the situation in the peninsula today. If you look at a satellite map, you will see that half, the south, is lit up with bright lights, lights of a free, prosperous, democratic society. The other half, the north, remains in darkness, a darkness of cruelty, repression, and poverty. And it has been mentioned today that if you are brave enough to want to try and escape from North Korea, very often you end up in China. China uses face recognition and other recognitions to make sure that those people are returned certainly to torture, and most likely to their death. And I think we're very honoured, and I have his permission to use this today, to have Timothy Cho in the gallery here today, who is one of those who tried to escape from North Korea. He failed on the first occasions, and he's got the huge scars all over his body of the torture he went through when he was recaptured. But he was even more brave to want to escape the second time, when mercifully he succeeded, and we are very proud to have him here in Britain. In 2013, the United Nations established a commission, as my right honourable said, of inquiry to investigate the human rights situation in North Korea. It appointed a distinguished Australian judge, Justice Michael Kirby, to chair it, and he, together with the experienced Serbian human rights campaigner Sonja Bizerko and the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in North Korea at the time, the former Indonesian Attorney General Mazerki Darusman, conducted a comprehensive set of hearings gathering witness testimony and first-hand evidence. And as has been quoted today, their conclusion was that the gravity, scale and nature of the violations of human rights in North Korea, and this is the important bit, reveal a state that does not have any parallel in the contemporary world. And I can tell you, as having been chairman of the North Korean group, some of the stories that I've heard are just unbelievable. And it's a harrowing catalogue of crimes against humanity, including extermination, murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, forced abortions, amongst a few of the atrocities they have to endure, as well as severe religious persecution, enforced disappearance and starvation. The inquiry recommended that this should lead to a referral to the International Criminal Court. So in more than a decade later, I would ask the Minister, what is the status of the UN Commission of Inquiry? What plans does the government have to revisit the human rights and humanitarian crisis in North Korea at the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Security Council? Finally, 75 years on from the war, the Korean Peninsula, North Korea is, of course, together with China, a major facility of President Putin's illegal war in Ukraine, providing Russia with weapons, munitions and men. And whilst we remember that 75 years ago, our brave soldiers were on the Korean Peninsula defending freedom, today North Korean troops are on the continent of Europe and on our doorstep, reminding us that independence and liberty cannot just be taken for granted. So finally, I would like to ask what steps the government is taking to hold North Korea to account for this act of aggression. We live in an increasingly turbulent and uncertain world that should remind us how imperative it is that democracies must stand together to defend freedom against tyranny and totalitarianism. Nowhere is there a clearer example of why that's needed than on the Korean Peninsula. Imagine what Korea would be like today if the Gloucesters hadn't taken such a heroic stance. All of us in this House should pay tribute to their courage and selfless actions.
Yeah.